They called them wooden coffins. And on June 6, 1944, every man climbed inside one. The sea was black in the pre-dawn dark, a low growl of engines rolling under a sky without stars. The smell of salt, oil, and iron hung thick in the air. All around, the channel heaved with hundreds of gray shapes, small, square-bowed landing craft lined up like a floating graveyard. Each one carried 30 men, rifles slung, faces chalked white under their helmets. They had been told it would be rough. No one had said it would feel like this, like waiting to drown before you even met the enemy. In the hold of one of those Higgins boats sat Private Jack Hutchinson from Ohio. 22, pale eyes, hands too big for the rifle stock. He had spent the night watching water slap against the hull, counting waves, trying not to think about what came after. The boat's sides were thin plywood and steel sheet, half an inch of faith between him and the Atlantic. Someone had joked earlier, "You're kidding me, right? We're crossing the channel in this?" The sergeant hadn't smiled. The wind cut like wire. A corporal in the back kept muttering scripture under his breath, the same line again and again, "Yeah, though I walk through the valley." Someone told him to shut up. No one really wanted him to. Every few minutes, a wave hit so hard the whole boat shuddered. Spray soaked their packs, their faces. One man vomited over the side and didn't lift his head again. A medic tried to pass him a rag, but it was pointless, everything was already wet. The helmsman, a kid from Louisiana, shouted over the roar, "Hang on tight, boys. She's built for swamps, not hell." Private Hutchinson looked down at the deck and saw water seeping through the seams. "How much can she take?" he asked. 3-meter wave, someone yelled back, quoting the manual like a prayer. "And bullets?" The sergeant grinned without humor. "You pray faster." For a few seconds, laughter rippled through the boat, dry, nervous, almost human. Then came silence again. Real silence, the kind that makes you hear your own pulse. In another craft to their left, a sailor had taken a piece of chalk and drawn a cross on the bow. Beside it, another man wrote a woman's name, Eleanor, and traced it with his thumb until the letters blurred. Farther out, engines coughed and roared, the line of boats stretched toward the invisible coast of France like a steel procession to the dead. The sky began to turn gray. The first hint of morning revealed what had been hidden: the sea wasn't empty. It was filled with ships. Thousands. Destroyers, transports, troop carriers, all crawling east. The men stared, wide-eyed. None of them had seen so much war in one place before. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. A lieutenant passed down the line, stepping over legs and gear. "Listen up," he barked. "Keep your heads down till the ramp drops. You move fast. You don't stop for anyone. If the man in front of you goes down, step over him. You got that?" No one answered. He repeated it, quieter this time. "Step over him." The words stuck like grit in their throats. Hutchinson gripped his rifle tighter, the metal slick from sweat and seawater. He could feel every heartbeat in his palms. At the bow, the sailor manning the winch spat into the surf. "We're 2 minutes out," he shouted. The engines roared louder. The smell of cordite drifted in from the horizon, the first artillery shells already falling somewhere ahead. Through the slits in the ramp, Hutchinson saw flashes, bright, sharp, wrong. One of the men whispered, "That's France." Another said, "That's death." Neither was wrong. The closer they came, the more the sea changed color, black to gray to something darker. Oil slicks spread like bruises. Floating debris knocked against the hull, a broken crate, a helmet, something that might have been a body. No one spoke now. The sergeant crouched near the ramp, shouting final orders: "When that door drops, get off fast. Don't bunch up. Don't stop for anything. Move." The ramp lever rattled. Every man braced. The engines cut back to idle. The boat slowed. Time thickened until it wasn't time at all, just breath and heartbeat and the weight of 30 lives pressed together. Someone whispered, "It feels like climbing into our own graves." The sergeant heard him. For once, he didn't disagree. Then, impact. The hull slammed into sand, hard enough to throw them forward. The world tilted, screamed, righted itself. The ramp chain clanged, unwound, dropped. Cold light poured in. Machine guns opened from the bluffs ahead, tracers slicing the air into threads. The man at the front caught one before he even saw the beach. He fell backward into the others, and the boat filled with shouting, water, blood. Hutchinson pushed forward anyway, boots sliding on steel. The surf hit him like ice, bullets snapping the surface inches away. He didn't think. He just moved. Behind him, more ramps crashed down, one after another, the wooden coffins emptying their dead and living alike into the tide. They had been told they were already dead. But they were the first to set foot in Europe. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. He wasn't a general. He wasn't even a soldier. But his boat changed the war. New Orleans, 1939. The air was thick with river heat and diesel, the slow pulse of the Mississippi beating against the levee. In a half-rotted warehouse near St. Charles Avenue, a man named Andrew Higgins was building something no one had asked for, a flat-bottomed wooden boat that could run through mud, reeds, and water barely deeper than a man's hand. Higgins was 54, short, barrel-chested, and always yelling. His shirt was stained with grease, his vocabulary could peel paint. The workers called him the Hurricane. When he laughed, it came out like an engine misfiring. He'd started with small swamp boats for trappers and oilmen, designed to skim through Louisiana bayous where propellers choked on weeds. But war was coming, and Higgins could smell profit the way other men smelled rain. If it floats in a swamp, he liked to say, it'll land on any beach in Europe. He said it to anyone who would listen, and to plenty who wouldn't. At the time, the U.S. Navy didn't believe in little boats. Admirals wanted steel hulls and big guns, not plywood with engines. They looked at Higgins's rough sketches, a box with a ramp at the front, and called it ridiculous. One officer sneered, "We need ships, Mr. Higgins, not toys." Higgins slammed his fist on the desk so hard that ink splattered the man's uniform. "Sir," he barked, "you'll need toys to win this war." He was right. But it would take the world's biggest war to prove it. When Europe caught fire, the Marines came knocking. They needed a boat that could drop men and trucks on a beach and back out before the tide turned, something no one had built before. The Navy engineers tried and failed. The prototypes sank, stalled, or stranded themselves on sandbars. Higgins sent them a telegram, "Come to New Orleans. Bring a stopwatch." They arrived skeptical. He took them to the river, where one of his swamp boats sat waiting, 15 feet of wood and stubbornness. The hull was flat, the propeller housed in a tunnel so it wouldn't catch. On the bow was a simple metal door, hinged like a drawbridge. "Looks like a shoebox," said a lieutenant. Higgins grinned. "Get in the shoebox." He fired the engine. The boat shot forward, skipping over water, mud, even a half-sunken log. When it hit the sandbank, Higgins lowered the ramp, jumped out in his boots, and shouted over the roar, "Now imagine 30 Marines with rifles." The officers stared, silent. One muttered, "Son of a bitch, it works." By the time they got back to Washington, the Navy wanted 1,000 of them. Higgins went home, lit a cigar, and called every carpenter, welder, and house painter he could find. "You want a job?" he asked. "Then forget what you know about boats." Within a year, his factory on Lake Pontchartrain was producing one every 23 minutes. Women worked the sanders, old fishermen shaped the planks, black and white laborers shared benches, rare for the deep south. Higgins didn't care who you were if you could build a hull that didn't leak. He walked the factory floor day and night, shouting above the hammering, "Faster, tighter, smoother. That's a soldier's life you're caulking." He slept in his office, boots still on, ashtray overflowing. Reporters called him the man who won the war before it started. He preferred boat builder. Each craft had a flat bottom, a steel ramp, and a single screw in the stern, ugly as sin, but perfect for landing anywhere on Earth. They named it LCVP, Landing Craft, Vehicle, Personnel. To the men who would ride it, it was just the Higgins boat. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Higgins's phones rang for 3 days straight. By 1942, his company employed 20,000 people and built 80% of all landing craft in the U.S. military. General Eisenhower would later say, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us." But Higgins didn't live for medals or headlines. He lived for the next problem. "A boat's only good," he said, "if it gets a man where he's got to die a little slower." He never saw the beaches those boats would touch, never heard the ramp chains rattle down into surf, never smelled the cordite or blood. Yet every soldier who stepped off into the sand of North Africa, Sicily, Tarawa, or Normandy owed their first 10 seconds of life to a man who built boats for swamps. One of his foremen once asked, "Boss, you think they'll remember your name after this war?" Higgins had spat out a piece of his cigar and laughed. "Hell no. They'll remember the boat. That's enough." And he was right. Because when the gray dawn came over the English Channel, it wasn't the generals or admirals who carried America across the waves, it was his plywood coffins with engines. And those toys, as the Navy had called them, would change the shape of the world. At 4 a.m., the sea was black. By 6, it was red. The wind came in hard from the west, slicing through the convoy like invisible blades. Rain fell sideways, stinging faces, mixing with salt and diesel. The men had been awake all night, sitting shoulder to shoulder in the holds of the Higgins boats, helmets bumping, breath fogging in the dark. Outside, the English Channel moved like something alive, groaning, rolling, swallowing light. It was June 6, 1944. The biggest armada in human history was moving toward France. 5,000 ships. 7,000 smaller craft. Almost 160,000 men. Every engine was a heartbeat in the dark. Every wave a reminder of how far there was still to go. Private Jack Hutchinson from Ohio was one of them, 31 men packed into a wooden rectangle 26 feet long. The floor sloshed ankle-deep with seawater and vomit. The air reeked of oil and fear. A corporal near the bow had been retching since midnight, eyes half closed, whispering for it to stop. The sergeant ignored him. Everyone did. When the first gray light cracked the horizon, the scale of it hit them, ships stretching from end to end of the world. Destroyers, troop carriers, hospital ships, landing craft bouncing like toys on the chop. To the east, tracer fire glowed faintly, thin orange threads in the fog. To the west, the cliffs of England were already gone. "The only thing we feared more than the Germans," one man muttered, "was drowning before we saw them." The helmsman, a sailor from Louisiana with a cigarette clamped between his teeth, yelled over the engine, "Hold on. Swells ahead." The boat dropped into a trough, then slammed upward, the impact knocking rifles against helmets with a dull, wet sound. Someone cursed. Someone prayed. Hutchinson's knuckles were white around his M1. He thought of home, the sound of a radio, a porch swing creaking. Then he thought of the photos he'd seen of the Atlantic Wall, pillboxes, mines, the wide beach called Omaha. He tried to imagine it empty, quiet. He couldn't. At 5:30, artillery from the battleships began. The sky flashed. The sea shuddered with each blast. Columns of water rose like geysers. A shell from the Texas hit the cliffs ahead and lit them in orange flame. For a few seconds, everyone cheered. Then they saw how little it mattered. The cliffs were still there. The guns were still firing back. A lieutenant checked his watch and shouted above the roar, 10 minutes. The words cut through the noise like a wire. Men began to move, adjusting straps, tightening helmets, wiping their faces with wet sleeves. The medic went down the line with morphine syringes taped to his jacket. "If you get hit bad," he said, "you jab it here, not here. Got it?" Nobody answered. The rain stopped suddenly, as if the sky had run out. The air turned sharp and still. Ahead, the fog lifted just enough for them to see the shore. It looked close. Too close. They could make out the black shapes of obstacles rising from the surf, steel X's, wooden stakes, mines bolted to the ends. The first boats were already there, grinding against the sand. Some had caught fire. Others were just gone, swallowed by the sea. In the distance, the low whine of German machine guns began, a flat, mechanical rhythm that never missed a beat. "Ramp down in 60, the coxswain shouted. He might as well have said, "Welcome to hell." The men crouched low. The ramp chains rattled like teeth. Hutchinson felt his stomach twist. He looked to his left, a kid named Miller from Kansas, eyes wide, lips moving silently. Hutchinson leaned closer and said, "You'll be fine." It wasn't true, but it sounded human. Then came the shriek, a high-pitched whistle that every soldier on every front would recognize too late. The shell hit 20 yards to their right, lifting another Higgins boat out of the water and snapping it in half like cardboard. For a second, all sound vanished. Then came the rain of debris, splinters, water, pieces of men. The shockwave hit Hutchinson in the chest like a door slammed by God. "Keep moving," the sergeant yelled, voice ragged. The boat surged forward, engine screaming. Another wave crashed over them, drenching rifles, filling boots. Someone shouted, "We're taking water." "Doesn't matter," came the reply. "We're almost there." Almost. Through the mist, the beach came into focus, a thin strip of gray sand beneath cliffs lined with muzzle flashes. Smoke curled across the surf. Bodies drifted in and out of view, spinning in the current. 30 seconds. Hutchinson's heartbeat drowned everything. The lieutenant raised his hand. "Get ready. When that ramp drops, go. Don't stop." A pause. The metallic whine of the chain. Then, sunlight. Harsh, white, cruel. The ramp slammed down. Water and bullets rushed in together. The man at the front took 3 steps and was gone, cut down before his boots hit sand. Another fell sideways, rifle clattering. Hutchinson jumped. Cold hit him like a wall. The weight of his pack dragged him under, he kicked, surfaced, gasping. Around him, men flailed, screamed, vanished. The water was red now, not metaphor, not poetry. Just blood and salt and noise. He stumbled forward, every step a decision, every breath a prayer. The beach seemed miles away. Machine guns tore the air to ribbons. A medic went down with his bag still in his hand. Someone shouted his name, maybe Miller, maybe nobody. Behind him, more ramps crashed down. More coffins opened. He kept moving. The wooden boats that were never meant to face bullets had brought them this far. And now, the shore that was supposed to save them was killing them faster than the sea ever could. The ramp of another Higgins boat dropped beside him, and what stepped out next would change everything. The ramp dropped, and hell rushed in. June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach. Morning. The tide was halfway in, the water thick with smoke and debris. The first Higgins boats hit the shallows, their flat hulls grinding into sand and barbed steel. Men rushed forward into machine gun fire that sounded less like weapons and more like a chainsaw tearing through the air. Of 32 landing craft in the first wave, 11 made it close enough for their soldiers to touch land. The rest burned, splintered, or simply vanished into the waves. MG-42s from the cliffs above ripped through the ranks, the sound faster than thought, rat-a-tat-a-tat-a, 1,200 rounds a minute. It didn't sound human. It didn't sound stoppable. Private Jack Hutchinson had jumped with the first wave. The shock of cold water had already taken his breath, but it was the noise that froze him. Bullets hissed through the surf like hornets. To his left, a boat erupted in flame, fragments of wood and men raining down into the sea. Someone screamed for a medic, a voice that stopped mid-word. They called them wooden coffins, Hutchinson thought, stumbling through the surf. They weren't wrong. The armor plates they'd trusted to protect them had become anchors. Dozens of men sank before they ever saw France. Packs too heavy, water too deep, fear too quick. Some went under silently, others clawed for the surface until the tide closed over them. A shell landed 20 yards away. The blast lifted Hutchinson off his feet, slamming him into the side of a half-sunk boat. He surfaced coughing, choking on seawater and diesel. Through the smoke, he saw something burning, not steel, not men, but the wood of the boats themselves, cracking like bones. "I heard wood cracking like bones," a Marine would later write. And I realized it was both. One sailor, the coxswain of a Higgins boat, had made it to the beach, his leg torn open by shrapnel. He turned his craft around, limping back through the surf to pick up a wounded soldier screaming in the water. The boat was on fire, engine coughing black smoke, but he didn't stop. He dragged the man aboard just as the flames reached the fuel tank. The explosion knocked both of them flat. Only one stood up again. Farther down the shore, a captain yelled over the chaos, "Get off the sand. Move. Move." But there was nowhere to move to. The beach was an open grave. Mortar shells fell into the shallows, sending fountains of salt and blood skyward. A man's helmet flew past Hutchinson, spinning, empty. He crawled forward, hands sinking into wet sand, each inch earned under a storm of lead. Behind him, the remains of a boat twisted in the surf, the ramp torn off, the name, Jenny 24, still painted on the side. He could smell it burning, salt, pine, diesel, death. The smell of D-Day. To his right, two men tried to drag a third toward cover. One fell halfway, his body jerking as bullets found him. The other kept pulling, whispering something over and over. Hutchinson couldn't hear what, maybe a prayer, maybe a name. On the cliffs above, the German gunners reloaded and fired again. They couldn't miss, there was nowhere to hide. The tide began to rise, covering the dead. Bodies rolled in the surf, tangled in barbed wire. The ocean had turned the color of rust. An officer from the 116th Infantry Division finally reached a small ridge of sandbags, half collapsed by shellfire. He waved to the men behind him. "Use the craters. Get to cover." But for most, there was none left. One soldier ducked behind the wreck of a Higgins boat, clutching his rifle like a cross. He could hear rounds slamming into the hull, punching through the thin plywood. Each hit sounded closer, sharper, more personal. He looked at the bullet holes and whispered, "Hold together, old girl. Just a little longer." The boat did, long enough for him to reload. By 8 a.m., the tide had swallowed half the obstacles. Many of the boats that survived the run-in had turned to rescue duty, circling back into the kill zone to haul the wounded from the surf. Their engines sputtered from bullet holes, their hulls leaking, their ramps gone. But they came anyway. Over and over. One pilot later wrote in his report, "We were told to deliver them. Nobody said we had to leave them." Everywhere, the same sight, soldiers hugging the beach, crawling from crater to crater, using the wrecks of the Higgins boats as shields. The very things that had delivered them were now the only walls they had. Hutchinson made it to a half-buried boat and slumped against its side, gasping for air. He could feel the heat of the fire still smoldering on its deck. Inside the wreck, a radio crackled with static, one last, broken message from another craft offshore. "Beach secure, beach, need." Then silence. He pressed his forehead against the wood. It was warm. Alive, somehow. The sea roared. The guns thundered. The world narrowed to sound and breath. And yet, through the smoke, through the fire, through the impossible, more boats kept coming. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Some sinking. Some breaking apart. But always coming. Hell couldn't stop them. And those wooden coffins, those impossible, fragile machines, delivered an army into the mouth of death. By noon, the sea turned calm, but only because there was no one left to fight it. The tide crept up the sand, washing over bodies, wreckage, and broken rifles. The smoke that had hidden the cliffs all morning began to thin, revealing what was left, a beach that looked less like a battlefield and more like another planet. Charred wood, twisted metal, helmets half buried in sand. The sound of waves replaced the sound of men. Private Jack Hutchinson had no idea how long he'd been crawling. His legs burned, his ears rang, and his hands were raw from the gravel. He found shelter behind the ruined hull of a Higgins boat, its ramp splintered, its engine silent. He pressed his cheek against the wood, feeling it tremble under the distant concussions of artillery. All morning, the sea had tried to push them back. Now, it was retreating, leaving the survivors stranded between water and fire. The Germans still held the ridges above, their machine guns coughing in short bursts. Every few seconds, a mortar shell slammed into the beach, kicking up geysers of sand and smoke. But somewhere behind all that noise, something was changing. The Americans were moving. A sergeant from the 116th Infantry Division was the first to rise. He had lost his helmet, his face blackened with soot. He looked more ghost than man. Up the bluff, he shouted. Move! Move before they reload. Hutchinson looked up and saw others following, 5, then 10, then dozens, crawling out from behind the dead and the wrecks, running low and desperate toward the slope. One man was hit halfway and kept going until his body couldn't. Another threw down his rifle, grabbed a satchel charge, and sprinted headlong into a bunker mouth. The explosion tore open a hole in the concrete. Minutes later, the firing from that position stopped. A cheer rose, weak, hoarse, half disbelief. Then another. And another. For the first time since dawn, someone on the beach shouted not in fear but in triumph. By 1 o'clock, small groups had reached the top of the ridge. From above, they could see the full sweep of Omaha, a patchwork of smoke, wreckage, and courage. Behind them, the second wave was coming in. The Higgins boats, what was left of them, returned through the haze, their propellers churning red water. They carried ammunition, medics, and more men. Some came back empty just to haul out the wounded. They came back, over and over, one survivor wrote later, like ghosts out of the smoke. Coxswains steered through minefields and wreckage, shouting directions over the roar of engines. A few made 10 trips that day. Some didn't make one. Each time they hit the beach, they took on more bullet holes, more scars, more names carved into their sides by men who would never see home. In the chaos, an officer from the 29th Division waved to one of the returning boats. "We need ammo," he shouted. The sailor on deck tossed him a crate and yelled back, "We're out of everything but courage." Then he turned his boat around and went back out to sea. By evening, the tide had brought the dead to shore. They lay in rows, Americans, British, Canadians, silent witnesses to the cost of the impossible. The wooden boats floated among them, burned black, their ramps open as if still waiting for orders. And yet, the beach was no longer lost. The cliffs were taken. The guns silenced. The way into France, open. Hutchinson sat near the edge of the water, helmet off, staring at the horizon. He could see more ships now, endless lines of them, each one bringing more men, more machines, more hope. The air smelled of iron and salt. A medic knelt beside him. "You hit?" "No," Hutchinson said quietly. "Just, still here." The medic nodded, understanding the weight of those words. He handed Hutchinson a canteen. The water inside tasted like metal. Somewhere behind them, engineers were already clearing debris, marking lanes through the wrecks. They used the surviving Higgins boats to ferry wounded to hospital ships, to drag in supplies, to pull stranded tanks off the sand. They were no longer just boats, they were lifelines. By sunset, the beach that had been hell only hours before was becoming a harbor. Smoke still rose from the cliffs, but through it came the sound of engines, constant, rhythmic, alive. In the command post offshore, an officer marked a line across a map and wrote one word beside it: secured. By nightfall, over 156,000 Allied troops stood on French soil. The impossible had been done, delivered not by steel fortresses or grand strategy, but by plywood and courage. As the last light faded, Hutchinson looked back toward the sea. Dozens of boats bobbed in the surf, their silhouettes black against the dying sun. Some were missing ramps. Some were half sunk. But they were still there, floating, stubborn, defiant, undefeated. He whispered to himself, "We made it." No one heard him. The waves took the words away. And far out beyond the horizon, the next wave of Higgins boats was already on its way. When Eisenhower was asked who won the war, he said, "Higgins did." By 1944, thousands of miles from Normandy, the war sounded like hammers. The rhythmic pounding of nails, the rasp of saws, the deep thrum of engines echoing through the shipyards of New Orleans. Higgins Industries wasn't just a factory anymore, it was a city made of noise and smoke and people who believed they were saving the world with every plank they laid. Andrew Higgins walked those floors like a general inspecting his troops. He wore the same oil-stained shirt every day, sleeves rolled high, tie crooked. The workers knew his footsteps before they saw him. "You call that a straight seam?" he'd bark, leaning over a welder's shoulder. "That seam leaks, a soldier dies. Do it again." He fought his war in the factory. More than 20,000 people worked for him, men too old to fight, women with rolled-up sleeves and hair tied back in scarves, young black welders who'd never been allowed near heavy machinery before the war. On his floor, everyone worked side by side. Higgins didn't care about color or class, he cared about boats. "If you can swing a hammer," he said, "you can help win the war." It made the newspapers in 1943, the first fully integrated factory in Louisiana. The local politicians hated it. The War Department worried about disruption. Higgins didn't care. "You think Hitler cares who builds the boats?" he said. "Neither do I." Inside those walls, America looked different, louder, rougher, but fairer than it did outside. They worked in 12-hour shifts, the air thick with sawdust and the sharp scent of marine glue. Radios played big band music between bulletins from the front. Every new report from Europe hit like a hammer blow: Tarawa, Anzio, Normandy. They listened, silent, whenever a voice on the radio said, "landing craft." By then, the numbers were staggering. 23,000 Higgins boats built by hand, one every 23 minutes. Each stamped with its serial number, tested in the muddy waters of Lake Pontchartrain, then loaded onto trains bound for the coasts. The workers began calling themselves the Ghost Ship Crew. They knew they'd never see the battlefields, never feel the ramp drop, but they imagined the soldiers who would. On the walls above their benches hung photographs of smiling Marines and letters that began, "Dear Mr. Higgins, your boat got me there alive." Still, the war ground on, and so did Higgins. He barely slept. Reporters said he lived on black coffee and cigars. He fought daily with Washington over steel quotas, fuel rations, pay caps. Bureaucrats tried to slow him down, he cursed them into silence. "We don't need permission to save lives," he told his engineers. "We just need more wood." By 1945, his shipyards covered 70 acres. The skyline of New Orleans shimmered with cranes instead of church spires. From the river you could see a forest of ramps and hulls stacked like coffins waiting for their soldiers. But success came at a cost. Higgins's hair had gone gray, his hands trembled when he lit his cigar. He'd stare at the blueprint spread across his desk long after midnight, listening to the faint hum of machinery still running. Sometimes he'd speak aloud, to no one in particular. "You better hold together, boys," he'd say softly. "They're counting on you." In the summer of '44, when word reached the factory about the Normandy landings, the workers stopped for the first time in years. The foreman climbed a ladder and read from the newspaper, how the boats had carried men across the channel, how they'd hit the beaches, how the wooden hulls had burned but kept floating long enough to deliver their cargo of human courage. For a moment, the entire factory stood in silence. Then someone started clapping. It spread like wildfire, welders, carpenters, secretaries, all cheering, crying, pounding their hands together until the rafters shook. "They made it," someone shouted. "Our boats made it." Higgins stood at the edge of the floor, arms crossed. He didn't smile, not right away. He looked down at the planks, the tools, the scraps of sawdust glowing in the sunlight. "Get back to work," he finally said, voice rough. "The war ain't over yet." By the end of that year, his plants had produced more than 20,000 LCVPs, 1,000 points boats, and hundreds of specialized landing craft. Every major amphibious invasion, from North Africa to the Pacific, rode on something that began in his mind and his shipyards. Yet when victory finally came, the orders stopped. The hammers went quiet. The lights dimmed. The workers drifted away, back to their old lives, back to jobs that didn't build history. Higgins stood in the middle of his empty floor, listening to the silence. He had won, but the war had taken the only thing he'd ever loved, the fight. A journalist once asked him what he thought of his legacy. He shrugged. "Boats rot," he said. "Freedom doesn't." He was right. But when the factory gates finally closed, and the sawdust settled for good, few remembered the man who made freedom float. They called them wooden coffins. But those coffins carried freedom. The war was over, but its ghost stayed behind, in the waves, in the ruins, in the quiet. Along the beaches of Normandy, the sea still whispered against the sand, dragging up what it hadn't finished with. Rusted helmets. Bent rifles. And sometimes, pieces of wood, gray and splintered, the remains of Higgins' boats the tide refused to forget. Decades later, tourists came to walk where the soldiers had died. Children built sandcastles beside the old bunkers. But if you dug your hands deep enough into the sand, you could still feel the splinters of history. One veteran, gray-haired and slow, stood at the water's edge one June morning. His name was Jack Hutchinson, though now he answered to Grandpa Jack. His steps were uneven, but his memory was sharp as the wind. He'd come with his grandson to see the place where, as he put it, I was supposed to die. The boy had asked what it was like. Jack didn't answer right away. He bent down and picked up a worn plank half buried in the sand. Salt had eaten the paint clean off, but you could still see the ghost of a stencil, LCVP 7013. He ran his hand across it, the wood smooth in some places, rough in others. "This," he said quietly, "was my ticket to hell, and back." The boy looked at him, confused. "It's just wood." Jack smiled. "That's what we thought too." He stared out at the horizon, where the sun cut through the mist like the first day of the world. "Every time I smell salt and diesel," he said, "I hear that ramp slam open again. I hear the ocean. I hear the men. And I remember how loud freedom sounds." Behind him, the waves whispered against the shore. For a moment, they sounded like applause. Across Europe, pieces of those boats were still scattered, buried in dunes, rotting in harbors, sitting forgotten in museums. Each one carried a story, a landing in Sicily, a storm off Saipan, a run through German fire at Omaha. Most were never recovered. Wood doesn't last. But the memory did. In New Orleans, where it had all begun, the old shipyard had been rebuilt into a museum. Tourists walked through halls lined with photos of young men smiling beside half-finished hulls. In one corner stood a fully restored Higgins boat, faded green paint, bullet scars patched but visible. Above it, a sign read, "The boat that won the war." A recording played nearby, the voice of General Eisenhower from 1945, "Without Higgins's boats, we could never have landed on an open beach. He is the man who won the war for us." Visitors stopped, listened, and moved on. Most didn't know who Andrew Higgins really was. His name had sunk into the footnotes of history, like the boats themselves, swallowed by time and tide. But the truth stayed in every grain of wood, every line of salt. In a letter found among his papers years after his death, Higgins had written, "Wood rots. Steel rusts. But courage, courage floats." He never saw Normandy. Never saw the beaches his boats delivered to history. But maybe he didn't need to. Maybe he understood that the measure of a man isn't whether he stands in the light, but whether he builds something that carries others into it. Back on the French coast, the tide came in. The water touched the old plank in Hutchinson's hands, soaking the salt back into the wood. He let it go, and it drifted out slowly, turning once before the current took it. His grandson watched it float away. "Where's it going?" he asked. Jack looked at the boy and smiled. "Home." The plank bobbed in the surf, caught a beam of sunlight, and vanished beneath the next wave. Above them, gulls wheeled and cried. The beach was quiet again. And somewhere in that stillness, between the sound of the wind and the sea, there was the echo of a ramp slamming open, not an ending, but a beginning. Because freedom, like those boats, isn't built to stay still. It's meant to carry you forward. Sometimes, victory isn't forged in steel. Sometimes, it's built out of wood, and faith. And long after the last veteran is gone, the sea will still remember. The tide will roll in and out, tracing the same rhythm the engines once made. Waves will break over the sand where boys became men, where fear turned to duty, and duty turned to something greater. The world keeps moving, but the ocean never forgets. If you stand there at dawn, when the light is soft and the wind is right, you can almost hear it, the sound of plywood slapping waves, the cry of an order carried on salt air, the breath of 1,000 men stepping forward together. That's where freedom lives now. In the sound of the sea. In the memory of wood. In the courage that still floats.